Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's my privilege to welcome you all to the Starting at Zero panel discussion this afternoon. My name is Penny Lee. I'm the Chief Fundraising and Engagement Officer at United Way of Central Indiana. And on behalf of the whole United Way team, I want to thank today's wonderful panel for the discussion that's about to happen. And also thank each of you for joining us today and being part of this very special event that is focused on early childhood education. There's over 450 people registered to be part of this conversation, so we're eager to get started. So in order to do that, I am pleased to turn over the stage to Shannon Jenkins, our United Way Senior Director of the Family Opportunity Strategy. Shannon?
Thank you, Penny, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's panel discussion centered around early childhood education and the documentary Starting at Zero. My name is Shannon Jenkins, and I serve as the Senior Director for the Family Opportunity Strategy at United Way of Central Indiana. United Way takes a vested interest in early childhood education and providing access to quality pre-K for families in Central Indiana to give children the best start possible. Tonight's moderated discussion will dive into the importance of early childhood education and how Central Indiana is impacted locally. I would like to introduce our panel moderator, Rebecca Lynch. A New York native, Rebecca became involved with United Way after moving to Indianapolis. Rebecca has been a United Way donor for 24 consecutive years and is pleased to apply her collective experiences and passions to further the United Way mission. She is a Tocqueville Society member and has served as a United Way ambassador, Read Up tutor, and a volunteer at many United Way community agencies. She served 2 years on the United Way Northwest Advisory Board and as the 2020 Lilly United Way Engagement Committee Chair. Rebecca is honored to be named the Woman United Chair and to serve on the United Way Central of Indiana Board of Directors. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca and our distinguished panel this evening.
Thank you, Shannon, and welcome to all of our panelists and attendees. I understand that there's attendees not only attending from the United States, but from multiple countries around the world. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you wherever you are. Today's webinar will be recorded for all of you to view again or to share with colleagues. And we wanted to let you know that we have turned off the chat feature today, but we have turned on the Q&A feature. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, please submit those using that question and answer feature. We will answer some questions live, and if we don't get to the questions live, we will answer those in a follow-up email next week. Starting at Zero explores the power of investing in high-quality early childhood education so that all families and children have the opportunity to attain the American dream. This film brings together the voices of policymakers, educators, academics, business leaders, pediatricians, parents, and children. It features 5 current and past governors who are champions of early childhood education. Governor Steve Bullock of Montana, Kay Ivey of Alabama, and Ralph Northam of Virginia, as well as former governors Jim Hunt of North Carolina and Phil Bryant of Mississippi. Starting at Zero examines the latest developmental brain science to demonstrate how essential the early years of learning are to maximize human potential. Key features of high-quality early childhood learning environments and experiences are outlined and then brought to life as this film delves into the evolution of Alabama's #1 nationally ranked state pre-K program. Here in Central Indiana, the Early Learning Advisory Committee, also known as ELAC, is working to ensure that children from birth to the age of 8 and their families have access to affordable, high-quality early childhood education programs that keep children healthy, safe, and learning. The governor appoints ELAC committee members who offer guidance and input to the governor's office, as well as the Indiana General Assembly. So data presented today throughout today's discussion is reference to the 2020 ELAC report. We are joined today by an esteemed panel of leaders in the early childhood education arena to discuss why this is important here in our community. Today we welcome Willa Kammerer. Willa is the director of the film Starting at Zero. We welcome Maureen Weber. Maureen is President and CEO of Early Learning Indiana. We welcome Dr. Nancy Swagonski. Dr. Swagonski is a physician and professor at the Department of Pediatrics at Indiana University School of Medicine. We welcome Khalil Maafrika. Khalil is an education consultant at the Kepler Institute. He is also an adjunct faculty in early childhood education at both IUPUI and Merton University. And finally, rounding out our panel, we welcome Dr. Lori DeSautos. Dr. DeSautos is an assistant professor at the Butler University College of Education. So let's start by talking about the film. I come from a family of educators, and I was personally very inspired by this film. I'd like Willa Kammerer, if you are the director of Starting at Zero, can you put this in context for us and tell us what inspired you to create this film?
Sure. First of all, thanks so much for, everyone watching the film and being here as part of this panel conversation. So the film was a complete collaboration with the Salzance Charitable Foundation. And their big vision is to put a dent in poverty. And they researched a lot of ways to accomplish this. And through that research, they really honed in on early childhood education as the way to do this. The foundation builds on the legacy of Salzance, who was a media entrepreneur and filmmaker, winner of Best Picture for The English Patient, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Amadeus. So he, a really big legacy to build upon. So I first connected with the foundation. They had funded a large and are still funding a large scale early childhood education initiative at Harvard Graduate School of Education, which I encourage you to check out. It's the Salzance Early Learning Initiative or Early Education Initiative. And I interviewed the foundation members as part of a project for that. For the launch of the initiative. And, that began our relationship. And about 6 months later, I got a telephone call. One of the board members of the foundation had met Gina Ross, the then Secretary of Early Childhood Education in Alabama. And, she was talking to him about the program and mentioned that it was #1 ranked. And, he just was like, I have to learn more about this. So he traveled to Alabama and saw the program in action and was really, really impressed, and gave me a call and just said, we have to tell this story. There's, more people need to know about this program and how they pulled this off in Alabama. So initially it was just going to be a 20-minute how-to video about the nuts and bolts of the program, which if you watch the film, that's still, part of the film. We wanted to create a really pragmatic, actionable tool for educators, for policymakers. But then as we began conversations in Alabama, that led to many more conversations in other states and traveling around the country. And we realized that it was a much more kind of comprehensive story that needed to be told about what is high quality, and then how do you accomplish it using Alabama as the example. So 3 years later, lots of travels around the country and conversations and interviews, and many cuts of the film is what resulted in Starting at Zero that you see today.
Thank you. It's an incredible film, very, very inspiring. So let's talk about the science of early brain and child development. Data from a recent Harvard study, The Science of Early Childhood Development, demonstrates that early preventative intervention will be more efficient and produce more favorable outcomes than remediation later in life. Dr. DeSautos, can you explain what happens in the early years of a child's brain development and how it can influence the trajectory of their future education? I think you're on mute, Dr. DeSautos.
Boy, you would think I would know that after a year. First, I just want to thank everyone for being here, and thank you, Willa, for this beautiful film, this documentary. And brain development is really brain and body development. So I don't want to just talk about the brain, because the maturation of the brain doubles in size from the last trimester through the second year of life. And the new research coming out of Harvard is sharing that the brain is wiring up. The synaptic connections are occurring at about 1 million per second. I can't get my head around that. And so we know that the brain is a social organ. We understand it's a historical organ. It is experience responsive and experience dependent. So, as I was again thinking about how the community can support parents and caregivers, as we look at brain development, we know that emotional regulation, which is stress regulation, occurs through emotionally available, consistent, present connections. And we've known that. I think we've intuited that for a while, but to really understand how our specifically right hemisphere in that first year of life is connecting to the right hemisphere of our caregivers is so critical, because the right hemisphere is connected more to the body than the left, and the right hemisphere comes on board in that first year of life. So that emotional communication, that down regulating of negative emotion and that up regulating of positive emotion is happening more often than not in those early years through nonverbal communication. It's through prosody, it's our tone, it's through touch, it's through warmth, it's through rhythmic patterned experiences. And so when I think about the brain's plasticity, which is our superpower, and I think about the malleability of all brains, we all have this opportunity. Yes, early development is critical, but as we move into early childhood education, the way that we greet a child, the way that we speak, the tone, just our entire presence can change that brain architecture. And because that brain is wiring up so quickly, it's the stickiest time of life. So, you might be thinking, well, what does this have to do with a 10-year-old or a 20-year-old or an 18-year-old? Everything, because those early experiences stick and they matter. And so our stress response systems can also be reprogrammed at an early age, and brain development is compromised. So just again, in a nutshell, this is why I'm so excited about this film, and I'm so excited that we in Indiana are really looking at early childhood and what we can do as a community, because it's not just about individual adversities, it's about those pairs of ACEs, those adverse childhood community adversities. And we know in our country right now, children are the poorest group in our population. I mean, this is a very impoverished, and that's hard to even say out loud.
Oh, thank you. Let's talk specifically about children from birth to the age of 3. We know that the children enrolled in these programs, these known programs, these high quality programs, are disproportionately preschool age versus the infant and toddler age, which highlights the need for more infant and toddler care. Now, this is where the costs are higher. There are fewer seats for those children. Given the resources allocated to pre-K in our state, what would you like to see as children arrive at the doors of pre-K, and what would you say is your wish list, Dr. DeSautos?
So I think that we need to meet our children where they are. That's my wish. And the brain develops from the back to the front and from the inside out. And oftentimes that 3-year-old is going to communicate through sensory stimulation. So for instance, at St. Mary's Early Childhood Center and at Early Learning Indiana, who we've worked with, we are meeting them with, just that again, checking in with our adult brain and body state, because emotions are contagious. So if I'm dysregulated, that child is going to pick up on that. So I've got to check in with myself. First of all, I've got to, make sure that, I am taking those deep breaths, that I have regulated my nervous system. And then we meet children, play in early childhood is really learning about how the sensory world, you kind of pick and choose off a buffet table. So we do tapping with the children, we move with the children, we create rhythmic experiences. It's not necessarily verbal, but it is just, I like to say, following the child's agenda. And so I think my wish is that we begin to teach deep breathing, and we emphasize movement and rhythm, and we emphasize just all those sensory opportunities that might have been missed in that first, maybe year or two of life. Because again, the brain has such plasticity. So we meet them with regulatory practices. I hope that's helpful.
That is. Any other panelists want to chime in with any of your thoughts on your wish list for those children?
Well, excuse me, sure. Let me go ahead and chime in. First, I just want to say that I could just sit and listen to Dr. Lord all day long. I'm like a groupie on LinkedIn. I just follow her things and everything she says. You got me studying the polyvagal theory and all that now. So first of all, just thank you so much. And I always start, and anybody who knows me, knows that very passionate about, young people. And I think I always try to give a disclaimer because when I listen to myself talk, some of my responses feel idealistic. But, I always start with a worldview that, number one, we are our brain, and that the early childhood continuum is the most important part of the human life. It established the foundation for our successes and unfortunately our failures. And unless we are highly intentional, highly motivated, and again, intentional about providing for young children, then we're really lowering the standards. So one thing that I want to see in terms of a wish list, I guess a few things, but I'll just start, is one that we pay closer attention to the entire early childhood continuum, which is really 0 to 8. And so one thing I've been sensitive about working in centers and all that is there's a very rough transition period in between pre-K and kindergarten. Sometimes you have children leaving learning centers, going to desk and rows over the weekend. And Dr. Laurie talks about this. These junctures in children's lives provide a myriad of detriments relative to the way their brains are functioning and what's happening. We know that what's most important about that rapid brain development is the development of the limbic system, which is the regulatory system for your social, emotional, and everything that goes into how we get here, why we're feeling, thinking, and the way we react. And we just, as a whole, as a field, we are not sensitive to each of those iterations of growth and development. So one other thing, two other things I'll share quickly is that I would love to see looping mandated, incorporated, 0 to 2 especially. I think that's important for workforce retention and recruitment. We can talk about that later. But I also think the regulatory patterns that come with the relationship tied to in those very fundamental years as parents are transitioning and handing off their children into schools, into centers, it would be amazing for a myriad of reasons if they could count on this teaching team or this group of teachers of regularity in those very important first years. And then lastly, I'm very sensitive to the disproportionate amount of young people that look like me that are being suspended and expelled at over 60% rate inside our schools. And so I think it's really time to have a conversation about permeating the executive levels, top administrative positions with people that reflect the demographics of our schools, and specifically those that are really being impacted, talking specifically about African-American boys as well, who, and so we'll talk more about it, but it's time for a culture shift in our field that really starts to pay closer attention to the needs of our underserved populations in our centers. So that's what I say in terms of wish list.
Do we have time for one more comment?
I think so. I'm not getting any signals otherwise.
All right. So just wanted to talk a little bit about the Sentinel study of the adverse childhood events that was more than 20 years ago. And I think most people have heard about it. You know, it's events in a child's life such as physical or emotional abuse or neglect, having a parent that's incarcerated, or domestic violence. And when children experience that, especially in the first 3 years of life, this is linked to poor physical, social, and mental health in adults, right? This has long-term, lifelong consequences, as well as the early learning and behavioral issues in childhood. So more recently, there's been some exciting research study about not just the ACEs, which I've always been a little frustrated with because it's like we're admiring the problem. What are we going to do about it? But really about something that's being termed positive childhood events. And these PCEs, or positive childhood events, are mitigate the effects of ACEs. And they're having supportive, nurturing relationships, safe, stable environments, social engagement and connectedness, and learning to control your social and emotional competencies. So when I say those things, and when you just heard Dr. DeSaltis and Khalil talking, those are the things that we talk about when we talk about early childhood education, right? This is what early childhood educators do. So really, to answer your question, what I would like to see is for children to arrive at the door with the demonstrated outcomes of these positive childhood events. And that is, they arrive showing a curiosity to learn new things, that they're able to regulate their behavior when challenged. And people talk about that, but if you think about it, for a 2-year-old, if they lay down and have a temper tantrum, what do you think? 2-year-old, right? By the time a child gets into even preschool, but especially school age, we expect them to be able to start regulating that behavior. And then another thing is really persistence, or some people call it grit, and working with new and difficult tasks. How do you stay with it even though it's problematic? So before I stop talking, though, I want to close the loop and go back actually to what I was first saying. Because for me as a healthcare provider, this isn't just about doing well in school or even being employed as an adult. I want to reemphasize that providing early childhood, high quality early childhood education and positive childhood experiences is really about overall health and well-being, and really has those lifelong consequences.
Thank you. That was all very insightful. And I want to echo what Khalil said as well. I've recently started following Dr. DeSaltis on LinkedIn, and she has incredible content. So all of you out there, I would encourage you as well. Very, very, very insightful. And thank you for all of your thoughts. Maureen, I was wondering if you would share your wish list, but also compare your wish list to the state's priorities according to their Birth to 5 strategic plan.
Yeah, so I'll start with a wish list item. And actually, first of all, thank you so much to the United Way of Central Indiana for hosting this, and to Willa, again, for your marvelous film. And I was attracted to a quote from one of the representatives in the film that said, "It's not the pan, it's the chef in the kitchen that makes things happen." And that resonated so much with me and with what really all of the other panelists have said. So as a provider, my wish list item is first and foremost that we can attract the kind of candidates, not just to teach in our pre-K classrooms, but really to work in our infant and toddler classrooms that understand the importance of this phase of life and are able to form the relationships that Dr. Spokonsky just talked about. So I think in terms of where we are from a policy perspective and thinking about the state's Birth to 5 strategic plan, which was created, many moons ago before we knew about this thing called COVID-19, all the way back like a year and a half ago. And the fact of the matter is it's a target-rich environment, right? There are a lot of different things that we could talk about. And there were a number of things that were talked about in that plan. Some of the largest ones that are moving forward, I think, relate in different ways to the wishes that the panel has had. Starting with an understanding of what quality looks like in early learning classrooms, and kind of rethinking our definition around that to expand upon what we understand under our current quality rating system, which, as many of you know, is called Paths to Quality. And so I think the state's interested in thinking about how do we know what's really happening in classrooms. And it doesn't come from a checklist of items of, whether a building can comply or not. We know that there's more to it than that. And so I think as we modernize our understanding of what quality looks like, we'll start to think about how do we represent those relationships, for example, differently in that measure. The second thing the state's very focused on, who will be of no doubt of interest to all of us, is better data systems that will allow us to think about these problems together, help us to understand the transitions between early education and the K-12 system differently, so that we can hold ourselves accountable and really just be able to take our own temperature and understand how we're doing at the things that we think matter. Two other areas. One is very much related to that, thinking about kindergarten readiness and how do we define kindergarten readiness? What is it that we expect children to be able to demonstrate as they show up at the door of the schoolhouse? And then ultimately, and this is a gigantic one, and it doesn't directly relate to the brain science question in particular, but it absolutely underpins it all, which is what is the infrastructure that we need that will allow us to support not just pre-K children, but children in the earliest years as well. And in some ways, those things, can be at odds. And so the state's thinking hard about how do we create that infrastructure that will cross over all of those years. One last thing that makes every list is goes back to my first point about not the pan but the chef, and I think the Birth to 5 plan and every plan probably any one of us would write really talks about the importance of that early educator and all the things that we need to pour into that person in terms of professional development to make sure that they're able to achieve the outcomes we're after.
Thank you. Dr. DeSatos, would you like to add anything to that?
So I was just listening to everyone's such wise words. And one of the things that, if I could add to, how we develop the infrastructure in our early childhood programs, and we look at, how we want to begin assessing, I'm thinking about how that brain and body are really, behaviors are communicating nervous system states. That's what behaviors are. And we are so focused as parents and as educators on behaviors. And as my colleague Mona Delahook says so beautifully, that behaviors are signals, they're indicators. And so we get so tied into these behaviors. So I would really love it. I think it's an adult paradigm shift. It's a mindset shift. And if we can begin to prepare our pre-service, which that's another topic, I think early childhood educators need to be, esteemed. This is the greatest time of brain and body development, and we need to hold them in esteem academically and how we revere the work that they're doing. And so I think if we can look at these behavioral challenges as really regulation and nervous system challenges, because, really from birth to 7, children are like digital recorders. They mirror their environments. They take in, and they again, they're not blank slates by any means. I don't mean that, but they are processing through emotion. And so if you don't grow up in an environment where there's kindness, you don't develop the circuits in the brain for kindness. I mean, kindness and empathy and self-regulation we have the propensity for those and the plasticity for those, but you have to be exposed to those experiences. And, Khalil, you're exactly right, because that we are disproportionately and over-identifying our Black and brown children at such an early age. And this is part of that school to prison pipeline. So, we've got to really look at the biosocial environment and really how do we prepare ourselves as adults to have a deeper understanding? And then what type of environment can we create in our early childhood classrooms that really promote what Nancy said so beautifully out of Harvard, are those growth experiences, that it's really post-traumatic growth. Because you're right, Nancy, we've been talking a lot about adversity and trauma. So now what do we do? And that's where I'm excited to go.
Great, thank you. Let's switch a little bit from the science to community. We agree that stakeholders across the state really need to see this film. This film is not just for educators. It's for caregivers, policymakers, business leaders, parents, frankly, there's a little bit of something for everyone. So I'd like each panelist to address why early childhood education is a community-wide effort and why there should be philanthropic, government, and corporate support. Khalil, can we start with you?
Sure, absolutely. And I say I'm a little dismayed to have to answer this question. I've been in the field for 20, 30 years, and honestly, we're answering the same question and still trying to convince people how important this part of life is. But nonetheless, we'll continue to play it again. First of all, and to support what I'm saying, one of the first points is to just look at the research. We can look at the Perry Preschool Project. We can look at the Chicago Parent Centers. We can look at Harlem Zone. We can look at right even here in Indiana, in New Albany, Indiana, in Mount Tambor Elementary School. From 2016, the school was rated F. They adopted the conscious discipline curriculum, and they went in almost 1 year, within a year's time, transitioned their whole school to a rating. So there is documentation, research that shows the upward trends, the progressive movement of all these socioeconomic issues with early childhood education, including decreases in crime, including higher rates of employability, including higher rates of marriage, lower rates of divorce, lower rates of crime, and all these things we've been able to record those in all their research. But I think most importantly, at least locally to hear, that in early childhood education, the amount of processing that is happening and done correctly and high quality is important, should be important to the business community, because we are actually preparing them for the 21st century skills. If you look at now the employability skills that we are looking for within our state, some of the language, I was just looking at some of the verbiage in the standards, and some of it's tied to, for instance, in self-discipline, demonstrate self-control and believe in accordance with rules, demonstrate endurance and capacity to complete tasks. These have advanced well beyond the typical standards of number theory, number concept. Not that those things are important, but early child education is when we can build the mind and create that opportunity or that palette to be able to grow. But I say one thing, and I say those things with a caveat as I begin to think about high quality early child education. And the caveat is this, is that also prison, as Dr. Lori just talked to, is also big business, and big pharma is big business, and food science is big business. And we have to be careful in our programs that we are not creating these great, magnificent programs that are actually indirectly and directly feeding these other sectors of society, because in some demographic, we are impacted fundamentally and for a very long time with some of the impacts. So that's what I'll say in my response.
Thank you. Maureen?
Sure. I was listening to my friends at WFYI this morning, and they were talking about the airline industry. And I thought, that's sort of what we are. I don't take a plane every day, but boy, I sure need the industry to be there when I do take it. And I think it's similar here. We're just one phase in people's lives that they're sort of passing through the early learning industry. But the fact of the matter is, if we don't have it, it's really hard to accomplish our goals. The United Way talks a lot about the 2-generational approach. We know that, it's critically important for not just today's workforce so that they can go to work and go proceed on their path towards self-sufficiency, but also the formation of the workforce of the future as well. So it's incredibly important for corporations and their own self-interest. It's important for the larger community. We know that overall corporations lose about $1.8 billion a year as a result of access to early care and education issues. State taxpayers lose about $118 million a year in the state of Indiana as a result of the same. So there is a government self-interest, there's a corporate self-interest, there's certainly a family and child interest. And there's work that we in the industry have to do as well to make sure that, that we're operating as efficiently as possible to help solve the challenges we face.
That's great. I love the airline analogy. I never quite thought of it that way, but that's really insightful. Dr. Swagonski, would you like to share your thoughts? Oh, you're muted.
There we go. So, Well, you know, we can't ever have a conversation these days without mentioning COVID, but Maureen did mention it first. So if there is any kind of silver lining to COVID, perhaps it's the recognition of early childhood providers as essential providers. I know our hospital system had to scramble to help our healthcare essential providers find care for their children so they could continue to provide care for our sickest patients. And I think many employers found the same thing. So I think that we have reached sort of a pivotal place where people will listen more about the importance of early childhood education. At least that's my hope. But even prior to COVID, I think of early childhood education's especially important in marginalized communities that are at risk for poor health outcomes. So this is going to be a broken record for me. I'm all about the health outcomes. Specifically, though, my interest in the prevention of infant mortality. Many of you already know that in Indiana, our infant mortality statistics have been horrible for decades. We have made recent progress thanks to the governor and a lot of efforts that have been going on, but we still have marked geographic and racial disparities, with some zip codes, Black infants having 3 to 4 times the infant mortality rate of whites. And although we think about healthcare, genetics, health behaviors as having a huge impact on health, these generally only account for about half of your health or well-being. The other health is really related to social and economic factors and your physical environment. So we have a grant from Riley Children's Foundation that supports early childhood providers as the vehicle to address these things called the social determinants of health to prevent infant mortality. So these social determinants of health are defined as the conditions in which you live, work, worship, and play. This is not about individual needs. A lot of people use social determinants of health when they talk about individual social needs, but this is about communities, and it includes economic, education, safety in the environment, resources, and other health factors. So I think that early childhood providers really serve a unique role, not only providing essential care for infants and children, but also serving communities as small businesses, employing others, allowing parents to go to work or school, providing early education, but also a trained staff. High quality care provides a safe and nurturing environment and provides role modeling and education to parents about a variety of topics, from child development to safe sleep. So when we talk about early childhood providers, they're remarkable in serving as an informal connector to additional resources such as health insurance and housing. We've worked with early childhood providers, one of who even helps her families with their credit scores. They do amazing work. So they are indeed essential providers, and yet they are undervalued and underpaid. We did a study on the impact of COVID on early childhood providers. And what was alarming was not only the impact of COVID on the providers themselves, but also the fact that there was significant mental and financial stress even before COVID, much greater than other Americans exhibited. So I wanted to just steal one quote from the Commissioner of Health up in Allen County, who's now retired. And she basically said, early childhood providers are trusted members of your family, essential members of your community.
Thank you, Dr. Swiansky. I think that was very insightful, and particularly, able to bring some insights about the COVID, the COVID experience, and elevating the importance even more of early childhood education. I'd like to switch now and talk to Willa. We want to talk a little bit more about the film. So we know that Alabama's first-class pre-K program, that's hard to say, is featured in the film. So I imagine you spent quite some time in Alabama during the course of production over the course of the 3 years. Can you share a little bit more about some of the behind the scenes and what are some of the things that made that program so successful and attract national attention?
Sure. Well, back to the airline industry and connection, the name First Class Pre-K actually came from first class flying experience. They wanted, as they were thinking about names, they were like, how can we, encapsulate what we really want, children to take away from this program, that really like first class, top-notch experience. So just another little connection there. But I think what really stands out is that there is support for the Alabama pre-K program that extends from all levels of the leadership, from the governor's office through multiple gubernatorial transitions. I always butcher that word. So through multiple transitions of governorship. And that is rather rare because often, governors will come in with a priority and that will be, the priority for their term. But then when leadership changes, that goes away and, there's inconsistency with quality. But due to this commitment, through multiple leadership transitions, the program has remained steady and has been able to continue to scale and develop and grow. And it's really been a point of pride in the state. So you have that high level leadership support. And then, you have the support really down to the community level and the classrooms, counties really wanting to be part of this program and parents really supporting the program. So that's one really strong suit. And also the business community is very supportive and has been very active in helping policymakers, as we were talking about, this is a business issue as well. So helping policymakers understand the importance of high quality early childhood education. And the business community is such a powerful voice in this because they really do have the ear of policymakers. Policymakers want to make the business community happy. So another feature is that they've just developed a really strong system. They have their framework for the program. It's all written down, but it's not a static framework. It's something that they're constantly iterating and developing on. If something's not working, they have the kind of flexibility and open-mindedness to change that. And so they're constantly revisiting the standards and how to kind of have this real spirit of continuous improvement. They also have a really strong professional development that is built into the program. They use a coaching model. So, every teacher has a coach who works with them. And then they also have monitors. So the monitors are kind of in charge of the compliance side of things, whereas the coaches really work on, kind of the skills to continue to develop them as teachers. And they really feel that having those as two separate functions is important for the kind of quality of those professional development relationships. And finally, I'd point out that there's a real accountability built into the system because it's a grant-based program. And so, the state just creates the standards and kind of administers the program, but each of the kind of individual programs are run at a local level. And so they apply. If they get the grant, they have to match the grant with local funding. And then they have to meet the quality standards. And the state's there to help them and wants them to succeed. But if they're not meeting the quality standards, the funding can be taken away. So that helps ensure that the quality remains consistent because there is that accountability. So those are the major things that come to mind.
That's great. It's great to hear that they built in that program for accountability. In 2020, there are over 500,000 children under 6 years old in Indiana. However, only a third of those who needed care were enrolled in care. So what does the landscape for early childhood education look like in central Indiana? And what are the successes and the areas for opportunity? I'm going to ask Maureen and Khalil to take this one.
Yeah, I'll start off if that's okay, Khalil. And, we have I think, three dimensions, and it's a gross oversimplification, but there are three dimensions that we often think about from a policy perspective, which is, what is the affordability of care? What's access to care overall of any variety? And then what's the quality of that care? And in central Indiana, as in the rest of the state, much of the country, affordability is just a challenge for families for ways that we've already talked about and will talk about forward. So I think there's really nothing that stands out, unfortunately, about us there. We are in the same difficult boat with everyone else. In terms of access, through a lot of good work by the United Way and others working throughout central Indiana for a very long time on this issue, we have made strides. And so whereas about 50% of the state, not quite, but close, is considered either an area of low capacity or a childcare desert, which means that there are about 3 children for every available seat. Central Indiana looks somewhat better than that, and specifically Marion County looks better than that. And so I think we've made some progress in recent years. The challenge then is if we put a quality filter over that supply, we have more work to do. And I think there's, opportunity statewide. We have only about a third of providers that are rated as high quality. And we can talk about those ratings and some of the challenges inherent there, but it's the measure we have right now. And we know that only about 20%, not quite, of children are being served in a high quality center or other site of care. And so I do think it's important that we continue to define quality, but fair to say by any definition, we have more work to do.
Thanks. Thank you, Maureen. And I totally agree. And I chuckle when you said, and we have to filter that through the lens of quality. You're right. But, steps to get there. And we are, continuing to work. And I remember when we didn't even have really a quality rating system here in Indianapolis. So we are definitely coming a long way. So and I view it as an opportunity. First of all, we are being looked at. Our field, early child education, is being viewed more and more daily, especially by our colleagues in middle school and high school, and and struggling with certain issues and trying to come up with solutions. So I think that's a key opportunity. Is that right now the verbiage relative to early child education is on the tips of many of the stakeholders' tongues right now, trying to figure out ways. So I think it's important. And I think on a more of a micro level, and I have to mention again, Maureen mentioned it, but COVID did give us an opportunity, especially from a community perspective, about things that appeared to be in peril, but actually provided some key opportunities. And one of them is around lowering ratios in classrooms. And I think that is important if we're actually talking about quality. And I think if those of us who are familiar with ratios, and especially down in our infant rooms where we are running minimum standards of 1 to 4. 1 teacher to 4 infants. That's right. For those not sure, 1 teacher, 1 person to 4 infants. I'll say that again. Just imagine, for those of you who are parents at home dealing with 1 or 2 babies, and imagine 4 in the most highly regulated, scrutinized field of all, just going through that. So I think it gives us an opportunity to look at creative ways to lower ratios. And this really challenges and pushes on the business model and opens up opportunity for other things like micro schools and other co-location models in different ways to go about looking at early childhood. I think that's an important opportunity. I think also that one thing we learned, at least in last year, is that when resources are dried up and when there's an issue around food and some of those basic amenities, our communities, our local communities, have to be empowered. Because if in fact, and we just have to be faced with that reality where people are in a way sequestered in their area, our children still need to be served. I received numerous of calls from parents and who were home with children and just fed up. I'm at my wit's end in August, September of being, a quarantine with our little children who have all these needs and desires at home, who still need those needs met. Our communities, where our least and most underserved children, need wraparound empowerment to provide parents and families and opportunities, with other means to educate and be able to manage with their children throughout as well. And I think it gives us a great opportunity to empower community centers, churches, schools, and homes home childcare as well is a good opportunity to start emboldening. And last, and I think Dr. Lawyer appreciate this, is that we are in an explosion of neuroscience and it is growing rapidly. And I think now gives us an opportunity to really have a much more pointed conversation with higher academia and talk about we need to include in all of our pre-service classrooms, undergraduate classrooms, at least a semester or a year, or at least some field work in neuroscience and understanding, and especially relative to, for our infant and toddler teachers, for those that are going and understanding the intricate steps that have to be taken and taken into consideration when dealing with our children. And as far as I see, this is a requirement of a complete overhaul of how we're currently doing, especially our infant and toddler education as well. So that's all I have for now.
Great, thank you. That was very insightful. Dr. DeSantos, would you like to chime in?
Well, again, so many thoughts, but just kind of in a nutshell again, we are in the infancy of really understanding the impact of the social developmental neurosciences. And, it's 33 decades of research. And yet I think when I think about, the challenges that we have with regard to, buy-in from communities for the emphasis of, like we said, we've been talking about this forever, but what is it going to take? And I think that, ultimately we are going to have to look at the science, because what we didn't have 30 years ago, even 20 years ago, brains develop through epigenetic social experiences. That's about all of us. It's not just what you're born with. It's not just genetics. It is really, we can change that our genome changes. We can, again, that's plasticity. So I think we're going to have to really hone in on the science for policymakers, for community leaders, and help them to understand what we're all talking about tonight. The other emphasis is on higher ed. And, we've got to understand the significance of that plasticity in those first few years of life. And our early childhood educators can be prepared coming in with, the work that they need to really set up the structures in early childhood. So there was one other thing. Oh, I know what I was going to say really fast. Dr. Ian McGilchrist shares that we've been talking about COVID, and he talks about a pandemic as being a meaning crisis. And it calls us to be collaborative. It calls us to really look at what was not going so well before a pandemic and, what doors have opened. And, when we think about community and education and looking at, what we have learned about the disparities during this time over the past 12 months, we have an opportunity now. We have an opportunity. The light has been shining on, our community adversities, generational trauma, racialized trauma, historical trauma, community trauma. We have been living in a collective crisis. And so I think, and I don't sound very positive, but I think what happens is when you take a look at that and when you see, okay, now what can we do? I think we have an opportunity, but I personally believe that the science is going to lead the way. And I think without that understanding, then we're just going to be having the same talk about behavior management, and behaviors. But one last thing, it begins with us, the adults, and it's just not about our children. We set that table. And so anyway, I could talk about that forever, but I just wanted to add that in.
Can I just add one thing to what Dr. Lori said, please? I'll go real fast. But I hope everybody got a chance to see the video that's first going viral right now, and that is the little boy who was helping his brother process through trauma and the breathing. If you haven't seen it, take some time, just Google in little boy helping his brother. But one thing that Dr. Lori says, and for the community, will be the science, because if we ever really become serious about crime infested neighborhoods and our communities and increasing homicide rates and all that, it is a very primal prescription that really starts with basic conflict mediation. you know, from a person who lives in the communities and, you know, frequents Family Dollars and all these stores in our communities, you know, you can watch and see the amount of, or the amount of anger, the amount of tension it permeates in our communities. Breathing, breath, understanding, cognizance that those body scans are crucial, and though they are, you know, not widely accepted currently, the only way we're going to push that, especially from our perspective, from an empowered perspective, is by employing some of those tactics that I know Dr. Lori and the rest of the panelists really agree with. So I just wanted to add that as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I saw that video actually just yesterday, and I thought to myself, I actually got emotional watching it.
I did too. It brought tears.
Yeah, it did. Yeah,
it was actually brought tears.
Incredible. And I thought to myself, everybody needs somebody like that in their life. Like, you know, that grounding, that calming presence, and that's so important.
If I can just tell you the amount of times that I've watched confrontations that just elevated because people have the inability to regulate, and how those escalate into people being killed and things like that. It's crucial for us. Conscious discipline and brain smart start are crucial applications for community empowerment as well. And we'll talk about it later, but thank you. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I really appreciate the insights into the science, the teacher ratios. I want to go back to something Maureen said, because I think it's a great segue into the next section. You know, you really talked about the three pillars: affordability, access, and quality. Speaking of affordability, I want to share some numbers with you as a segue into the next section. So the annual cost of early care and education tuition for a family with an infant and a 4-year-old is $21,680. So I'm going to repeat that. A family with an infant and a 4-year-old, the annual cost for their care and education is $21,680. That is a lot of money on an annual basis. So this really underscores the need for scholarships and increased funding for this pre-K. Maureen, I'm going to address this to you because I know you've led efforts to increase funding for Indiana's pre-K program, which is called On My Way Pre-K. Can you tell us about what strategies you use to increase the funding and how to help in the current environment?
Yes, well, I think you're very generous with your verb there. I think we partner very closely with the United Way of Central Indiana, who's been a leading voice on this issue, really from the beginning of the On My Way Pre-K program. And you know, it's been a very successful effort in Indiana. We have about $22 million annually, but to put that in perspective for you, that assists somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 4-year-olds. And in any given age bracket, there are 80 to 85,000 children in Indiana. And so we have, again, I think, opportunity ahead of us. One of the things that's been so successful about the On My Way effort really is that it has been a coalition of the willing. We've had involvement from Lilly and PNC and Cummins and other corporations. We've had, again, leadership from the United Way, but really had dozens of participants from around the state really locking arms around this issue, and I think have been very focused on making slow and steady, meaningful progress, and that's worked out really well for us. I've only been engaged in this world for about 3 years, and over that short tenure, I've seen the conversation with legislators change fairly dramatically, from folks who were kind of wondering why we were spending time with them in the early days to now people really interested, and sometimes they're interested because of the economic development impact. Sometimes they care deeply about what's going on in families and communities. And sometimes they're just thinking about the vitality and the strength of the communities and sort of placemaking goals that we have. And I think from our perspective, as part of the Early Education Works Coalition, any one of those is fine. We'll talk to them on any one of those topics or others as well. I think whatever brings them to the table, we're just glad that they're here. I will say, I think we're in a very fluid environment as a result of what's happened recently in Washington. And to put that in some perspective, while the state funding represents still an important and crucial piece of what we do, prior to the most recent stimulus packages, federal funding through Head Start, Early Head Start, Child Care Development Fund vouchers represented about a 15-to-1 ratio, federal to state dollars. Within the last 2 stimulus packages, first in December and then the American Rescue Plan, we had about another $1 billion of child care funding coming to Indiana. So I think our charge is to work closely with the state to make sure that we are doing everything we can to ensure that those dollars are spent just as wisely as they possibly can be to address some of the longstanding items that have been in our wish list.
Great, thank you. Dr. Swagonski, I'd like to address the next question to you. Can you share some insights regarding the impact of the potential expansion of the child care tax credit, which would provide monthly checks to families with children? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I keep doing that. You'd think I'd know better after a year also. So thanks, Rebecca. So there's really 2 tax credits that we could talk about. So the first is the child tax credit, and it increases the tax that you claim as a dependent. And it goes from $2,000 to $3,600 for a child less than 6 years of age. But it also provides a credit for families with older children of $3,000. The second credit is really the child care tax credit. And that's the one that covers out-of-pocket expenses for care for dependents. And it also increased both by the amount, but also in the percentage that you're actually reimbursed for expenses. So for example, in 2020, for a single child less than 13 years of age, for care of that child, you can claim about $1,050. That rate has gone up now so that you can claim as much as 50% of $8,000 or $4,000. So it's increased 4-fold. For 2 or more children, that amount has gone from about $2,100 to $8,000. So a significant boost to families. But perhaps the most important change, well, that certainly was important, but another important change is that for both credits, the full amount is now refundable. So what does that mean? Well, it's especially important for low-income families, and it's easier actually to explain in the opposite. Our previous tax credits were not refundable. And what that means is that it only reduces your tax liability. So for low-income families who frequently have little or no federal tax liability, they can't take full advantage of the tax credit. Now they actually get the full amount as payments, even if they don't pay a lot of taxes. So it's really huge, especially for the child tax credits. If you have a single child less than 6 years of age, they're going to start getting 50% of the payments in monthly installments between July and December, resulting in about $300 per month over the next 6 months and a final payment when they file their taxes. So, why are these kinds of things important? I think intuitively we think about it, but the statistics that people have already talked about are really alarming. 1 in 5 children in Indiana lives in poverty. 1 in 5. A mom with the 2 children that you mentioned at the beginning, the federal poverty level is $21,960. To pay for high quality childcare, that mom would need to spend $21,680. So basically she would have, let me do the math real quick. Okay, I can't really do the math real quick, but $80 left over for the year to spend on everything else. Another fact that we know is really there's marked disparities. So 34% or about a third of Black children in Indiana live in areas of concentrated poverty, which means not only are you poor, but your neighbors are as well. So there's a lack of resources within the community and a lack of a social safety net within your neighborhood. So if you think about those early brain connections that Dr. DeSantos and starting at 0 all talked about, setting up the foundation for all the later brain development and learning and how they're shaped by babies' experiences. And then think about the impact of poverty. How stable of an environment do you think people are able to provide if they're couch surfing and unable to find housing, which is true of many people in poverty? And if your child's hungry, how well do you think that they can learn? So poverty is especially potent on very young children. And it's now recognized as one of those adverse childhood events that we talked about. And we know that children who live in poverty, especially in those early years, are likely to fall behind on language development, have poor subsequent reading proficiency, other subsequent delays, and then the long-term impacts that we talked about, long-term earnings, as well as poorer health outcomes.
Thank you. Very insightful. I want to switch gears now and talk about the workforce, the early education workforce. I'm going to share some other numbers with you. So in 2018, the Indiana Department of Workforce Development, the DWD, reported that there were 27,000 early care and education workforce jobs. We consider that there's about a 30% turnover rate for that. And so in 2028, which is in 10 years from that date, we need 36,000. So again, in 2018, it was 27,000. 2028, we're expecting to need 36,000. With a 30% turnover rate, we expect an early childhood education workforce deficit of 8,239, so over 8,000. I want to ask all the panelists, maybe starting with Willa from the Alabama perspective, let's share your ideas and your solutions to recruit and retain some of the early education workforce and the talent pipeline.
Sure. Well, we could have talked about this, as part of what makes the Alabama program so high quality, because it has been, a key feature of their success. But the state worked very closely with the higher education system, from community colleges, state colleges, to have their teacher education programs really match up with the needs for creating high quality teachers in the state's early pre-K program. And so that, it was a slow and steady process. It wasn't, the easiest process to align vision and teaching methods, but the payoff has really been worthwhile, because the teachers that are coming out of the programs in the state are, really well prepared for the needs of creating high quality early childhood experiences in the state. And the other key feature is of the Alabama program is that pre-K teachers are paid the same amount as teachers in the K-12 system, which is huge, because I think across the country, so many early childhood educators, someone else on this panel is going to be able to give the statistics much more, but so much of the early childhood workforce is living in poverty themselves and on federal assistance. And so so many early childhood educators want to stay in this field. They're passionate about the early childhood years, birth to 4, but they can't, because they can't pay the bills. And if they're not able to pay the bills, they can't show up and be the best they can at work. And so having that pay parity is huge, because it helps retain the workforce. Those who want to stay in the early childhood classrooms can stay in the early childhood classrooms, and that consistency also has really helped the quality of the program. So those are two major things that I would say from the Alabama experience.
Thank you. Khalil, would you mind commenting before we go to the final segment?
Sure. I can just give a very oversimplified answer and say, just professionalize the field. Take the burden of salaries off of, the centers, and then we're done, and that's it. And, and here's another part of that. I just don't believe that there's really a resource issue. I believe there's more than enough money to ensure that. But since that's not what we can do today, I'll just try to share some more practical strategies that I think would be helpful. I think relative to just the whole teaching workforce, I think there's a misalignment in skill set. And I think that if we specialize the field more and really start in higher ed and really started to specialize the field, we would see teachers building more resilience and desire to stay in the field. What I mean is that the current system kind of purports that your newest, freshest teachers start in your infant, your younger classrooms and kind of work their way up in this hierarchy. When in all actuality, the most skill set probably needs to be down with the younger ages and to kind of pair and get a better understanding about what's happening. So I think if we start taking a closer look at how we are placing teachers and where they are, I think that's important. I think in the field that as administrators and leaders of organizations have to take a closer look at the transference of skills and the amount of skill development that happens in the classrooms and in the ranks of managers and center directors and assistant directors. They are developing a myriad of skills that are transferable. And I know Maureen doesn't want to say this one, but in all actuality, if you really want to retain your staff, you really have to train them out of the classroom because they have to feel that there's a trajectory for growth and development in that space. And currently, we don't have that. We would love for our teachers to stay in those classrooms forever, keep doing the great work, but a 2 to 5 year window is really good for considering the way we do early childhood now. It's a very stressful environment. And so I think that's important. I think specifically tied to some of the disproportion, I think we're looking at now less than 2% of the teaching population are people of color. And again, more than 60-70% of the children that are having the most difficulty in our classrooms are children of color. The way that we attract people of color is not through the classroom, but it's from the top down. What people like me have to be able to see and people of color have to see is, again, a trajectory of growth, not just into a job, but into an opportunity to transcend my social economic status. That places gives me an opportunity to be able to not just work and learn as a teacher, but to ascend into a higher management positions. And the other tentacles that come in the field, there's all kind of information, technology jobs in the field, paraprofessional, there's hundreds of opportunities in the field. And we just kind of, pigeonhole our teachers in that world to stay in the classrooms. And then I think, again, finally, and I just, I can't reiterate it, most importantly, if we ever going to be really serious about moving teachers and recruiting and retaining people of color, there have to be trajectories of growth and development for them to be able to see and visualize and imagine moving forward. I can't belabor the point about the lack of resources, and obviously we bringing in people, or especially men, providers of households and things like that, with minimum wage. There's no way we can attract them, but yet there are opportunities, and there's a great pleasure and reward in being able to provide the connections with young people as well, children as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, those are some, discouraging numbers when you hear that only less than 2% of educators are people of color, and also that we don't have pay parity, that some of these educators are struggling themselves. So that's definitely something that we need to address. In the last few minutes, I think we'd like to have a call to action and have each panelist take maybe 30 seconds to tell us, just thinking about the impact of a collective voice, what can our viewers do today to advocate for quality early learning experiences? So maybe let's start with Maureen, and then we'll go to Dr. Spogansky, Dr. DeSottles, and then Khalil.
Sure, thanks. There are so many things that can be done. I think, depending on the level of your interest and the kind of way that you want to use your time, talent, and treasure, starting with, if it's of interest, to join the Early Education Works Coalition. We're always looking for new members, and we'd be glad to have you. I think if you are an employer or you are employed, having a conversation with the corporation for whom you work about the ways in which they support early care and education and how they might be differently involved will be very critical as well. And then lastly, if you are so inclined, one of these days we are going to be on the other side of COVID, and we'd love to have volunteers in our centers. I know others do as well. And we can't thank you enough for the gift of your time.
Dr. Spogansky?
Oh, Sorry, I'm up. So I almost feel like I'm going to be a little lame when I'm saying this, but one of the things that we did a survey, and what we found is exactly what Khalil found, is that early childhood providers are stressed. And in fact, we looked at before COVID and then after COVID. And what we found was before COVID, early childhood providers were markedly, significantly more stressed than the general population. And that, in fact, increased 2 to 4 times after COVID. And so what I'm going to say in some sense is be kind. I really think that if we could all just tell early childhood providers how important they are to families, to us as a community, to the state of Indiana, that is the first early step that I think almost anybody could do.
Thank you. Dr. DeSantos?
Well, I think I go back. I feel like I'm a broken record, but I think that we do need to really look at professionalizing the field of early childhood. And we also have to really look at how contagious our brains and bodies are, because we know a dysregulated adult cannot regulate a child. And so a call to action for me, I spent the last 3 years with St. Mary's Early Childhood Center. I wanted to go in and I wanted to be on the ground level, and I wanted to go in and sit beside the teachers, and I wanted to learn about this specific age group because I knew the significance of the development. So I would encourage anyone on the panel, if you have any volunteer time after COVID, if you have an opportunity to go in and to assist and to be a part of the classrooms. I think that's where the work happens. And so I think, just getting a feel and then really promoting this to our universities. Honest to God, universities, to change curriculum in a university is just, Nancy, you're smiling, but it is unbelievable. Like, it's unbelievable. So I think that's, we've all got to speak. The last thing that I want to say, isn't it interesting that we subconsciously, I think, now I'm generalizing, but I think we subconsciously think that teaching early childhood or kindergarten, you're teaching the content, like you don't need much. My daughter Sarah said that to me, and I started thinking about it, and I thought,
I agree with that, Dr. Lori. Not to interrupt, but you are totally right.
Yes, and I'm like, this is, we should have triple doctoral degrees for early childhood.
Right, right.
This is just crazy. It's not just teaching 4 and 5 and 6-year-olds. This is critical development. So anyway, that's all. I just had to say that.
And I just champion that. And that's what I just say. I just ended with just raise the standards. Higher ed, raise the standards for which we are graduating our teachers, incorporate neuroscience, in our curriculums. Raise the standards for in the documentary. I watched it. I was just enamored by the work they're been doing in Alabama since 2000. But I was also somewhat, again, just troubled by, knowing that we're celebrating paying our teachers as well as we pay our elementary teachers. And we don't pay our elementary teachers well either. So, this is where we are. And then I also heard, we are guaranteeing in the project that, children receive at least 1 nutritious meal a day. And my heart just drops, because we don't think about, and again, here comes a very idealistic, simplistic way. We ensure that our professional athletes and all those other people eat very, very well. We do go out of our way to ensure everybody eats well, but our most precious resource, we can ensure they receive 1 nutritious meal a day. So we have to raise the standard all the way around for our children. And then inside of our centers as well, raise the standards for our parents, and then raise the standard for how we treat our children. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, On behalf of United Way, Women United, I want to thank all of you. Thank you, Willa, for making this amazing film. It was so wonderful and so educational, particularly to see this Alabama's, first-class program is just absolutely incredible. And to the rest of the panelists, thank you for sharing your insights into this very important topic. Before we close out, I have two quick announcements. First is that we are launching a pre-K scholarship launch. So nearly 2,000 students from low-income families received scholarship support to attend pre-K. So, and part of that, 5% of that is through a philanthropic match, which ends up to be about $112 annually per student. So next week, look for a new scholarship launch. And then finally, to close it out, I'm the chair of Women United. So on behalf of Women United, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming and participating. We have about 1,000 members locally here in Central Indiana, and we're looking to grow that. And we're also looking for leaders as well. We are currently recruiting for our steering committee, looking for about 10 people. So if you are interested in either joining Women United or taking a leadership role within Women United, you can respond to the email that comes out next week, either to myself or to Catherine, and we'd be happy to get you engaged. Education is one of the signature causes of Women United, and so we will take all the help that we can get. So on behalf of everyone, thank you all for attending.